This presentation will help you understand how to argue about literature. Let's start by asking, what is literature? Literature can be both fiction and nonfiction, or even in between, having both elements. For example, the historical fiction takes real events and possibly real people, but then embellishes on them or fictionalizes certain elements of it. Now, when you think of literature, contemplate if it must be creative or unique. For example, do car manuals or should car manuals be considered literature? Or is literature just the classics? Now this brings us to our last question. What makes up the canon? The canon is kind of a fancy term for describing great works of art or literature. Now when you think about what makes up the canon, you have to ask, who is choosing what belongs in the canon? Generally, historically speaking, the people that decide what books are great also have a good deal of power. So when you think about what creates the canon, you can also think about who gets marginalized in this canon. And we'll talk about that more when we get to Edward Said's theory on Orientalism. Now let's ask why we study literature. First of all, it's to widen our experiences with life. By reading a book like The Kite Runner, you are transported to Kabul, Afghanistan in the 1970s, something most of us would never get to experience. It also helps us deepen our understanding of life's complexities. And this means, let's take for example, the theme of secrets in The Kite Runner. Throughout the novel, each character seems to have a secret, and some of them have no choice in keeping that secret. By seeing others do this, fictional or not fictional, we can kind of connect to life in general. Why do we keep secrets? Is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? Each character has their reasons for keeping secrets, some good and some bad. And also note that it's different depending on perspective and opinion. Another reason is to understand our nature as well as that of others. So seeing why people keep secrets, to continue this example, can help us understand why we would as well. And that of others. Maybe you had a secret kept from you. By understanding why a character like Baba kept his secret, maybe it'll help you understand why the person kept it from you. Another reason is to develop sensibility and compassion for human beings. In other words, it helps you become more empathetic and create a higher level of emotional intelligence. It also helps you arrive at certain criteria for evaluating the subtleties of human behavior. Many times we may have actions that we're not sure hurt people. For example, if you're late to work every day, you may not see how that's affecting your coworkers. But if you read a story about someone who has to deal with someone that's late to work every day, maybe that'll help you see what it's like on the other side. Lastly, it helps you achieve intellectual growth and the power to tackle our troubles in a more effective way. Really, this should remind you of the lecture on critical thinking, because really this last line is saying it helps you critically think. This slide shows you some common genres in literature. The 5 most common ones are short stories, novels, articles, drama or plays, and poetry. Now in the discussion question for this week, I'm going to ask you to try to think of some more. Can you name any more? And if you can't, I'll share some more with you in the discussion board when we talk about the purpose of literature. Now let's start off by talking about the narrative. Know that every narrative must have at least a resemblance of these 3 elements: plot, the action, character, which can either be people or a personification of an object or human. It just has to have human characters for it to be a character. Setting, which is the time and place. Keep in mind that many different genres have different narrative elements, like I'd mentioned before, with short stories and the novel. Now, when we think about literature, notice that literature uses an illustrative example of setting. So let's compare and contrast an encyclopedia definition and what we'll see in the Kite Runner of Afghanistan, or more specifically, Kabul. The encyclopedia is going to be concerned with facts such as political issues in Afghanistan, the geographical location, and its population, etc. Also, ethnic backgrounds and the ethnic makeup of an area. Whereas when you read it in the Kite Runner, it's going to go beyond that and places these facts in a human context, and thus conveys a certain attitude towards Kabul and the people living in it. So it's not going to be so straightforward. And keep that in mind. The writer has control of the tone and the attitude towards the place, as well as the reader. We'll talk about that more when, again, we go to Edward Said's On Orientalism. Now, when we think of character and characterization, again, the character refers to any imaginary people or personified objects or animals that the writer creates in their narrative. Now, characterization is just the treatment of that character. So when we think about the main characters in the Kite Runner, the questions in terms of characterization are more like, how is the character developing throughout the novel? What changes does the character go through? Now, there are many different types of characters. Let's compare flat versus round. Flat characters are constructed around a single idea or quality and assigned minor roles in the events of the story. Whereas round characters possess complex personalities capable of surprising in a convincing way. Now, I don't want to give too much away of the story, but when you think of the flat characters in the Kite Runner, I will give you a clue that the flat characters are actually, I would say, the enemies in the novel, whereas all the round characters we seem to really like. Now let's talk about static versus dynamic characters. Now, static characters are usually flat, and they retain the same traits throughout the story. They also do not undergo any serious changes. So generally, flat characters take a back seat, whereas static characters actually could be a main character, even though they're usually not, but the key point is that they don't have any changes. Now, dynamic characters change and modify their outlooks in response to the events that they are seeing, and they are usually round characters, so these do sort of go hand in hand. Now let's talk about the principles of characterization. Appearance could be a factor. What color eyes do they have? What do they look like? Are they tall, short, for example? What do they dress like? Are they sloppy or neat? Do they spend a lot of money on their clothing? Or do they just wear whatever they have available? Their speech and actions can contribute to their characterization. Pay close attention to dialogue. What about their surroundings? And this becomes very important in the Kite Runner as we see that the characters move from Afghanistan into the United States. How do those characters change? Both are round characters because both of them do change. Names can also be significant. Maybe looking up the meaning of a character's name can help you understand them more. Now let's talk about setting more. The setting is the physical work of the world, and also the time in which the action of the world takes place. the social environment of the characters, manners, customs, and moral values, which we will definitely talk more specifically in regard to the Kite Runner. Now, as you read the Kite Runner, think about how setting is treated in both places, and especially in time. Is the character reflecting back more from the past, romantically, towards the beginning? And how does he change towards the end? Now, as we talked about before in critical reading, active reading is another term for the same thing. Now, you're going to want to read the first 10 chapters of The Kite Runner the next week, and I want you to focus on the characterization and the setting. Think of the principles, the characterization for each character, appearance, dress, speech, and actions, surroundings, and their names. Now, when you contemplate the setting, you may have to look up the history of Afghanistan. But next week, I will also provide a short lecture talking about the history. And of course, just a reminder, mark up your text. Unless you borrow it from the library, use Post-its. You're going to want to, underline striking passages, make notes on the side of the page. And after each chapter, I would recommend writing down a brief summary or any important events. So I hope this helps, and good luck reading.